All right, we're going to continue our look at production reports here, just looking at the unit information section. Here we're going to utilize the FIFO costing method, which is a little different than the weighted average costing method. So here the issue is there is going to be beginning work in process inventory in place. And the idea with the production cost report is we're tracking costs on a per process basis, but also a per period basis. And now when you have beginning work in process in the picture, now you're melding together multiple periods and multiple costs information. And costs might vary from period to period. We don't want to muddy the waters there necessarily. So we're going to look at how do we deal with that here in the production cost report, specifically the unit information section. So DeRozan Inc. produces basketball shoes in two separate departments, assembly and inspecting. In the assembly department, all materials are added at the beginning of the process. So immediately, all units, that should click in your mind, are going to be 100% complete with respect to direct materials. Production data for June is as follows. So units in process as of June 1st are 35% complete with respect to conversion costs. And that's 14,000 units. Units completed and transferred out during the month of June were 76,000. Units in process as of June 30th were 60% complete with respect to conversion costs, and that's 23,000 units. So using the FIFO method, what would the units information section of the report look like? So if you download the template and enter the information, you should get this. So we're just going to focus on the units information section. So we start with, again, our units to account for, units accounted for. Our units to account for, we start with units in beginning work in process. And remember, these are actual totals, so these are actual amounts. So it's not necessarily the equivalent units amount just yet. So we have 14,000 units in beginning work in process. Again, that is simply given in the question there. The fact that they're 35% complete with respect to conversion costs, we don't need to worry about that right now. We add to it the units that were started during the month. Units started during the month is calculated by this formula, which is units started and completed plus ending work in process. But nowhere in the question does it say units started and completed. It says units completed and transferred out, but nowhere does it say units started and completed. We have to calculate units started and completed. And how do we calculate that? It's this formula right here. Units that were completed during the month, which we have, which was 76,000, less units in beginning inventory, which we already said was 14,000, excuse me. So after making the correction, I just noticed here, my apologies, everyone. We're trying to figure out units started and completed during the month. Units started and completed, remember, it is units that were completed during the month. In this case, were 76,000 units, less beginning work in process inventory, which was 14,000 units. That means of the 76,000 that were completed this month, 62,000 of them must have been started during the month as well. So started and completed was 62,000. Of those, 14,000 were from beginning, and then an additional 14,000 from beginning. So total completed and transferred out was 76,000, which again, we have here. Now that we know the amount that was started and completed, we can figure out how many units did we actually start during the month. During the month, we started and or completed the 62,000 that were fully completed and started during the month, plus the units that were in ending work in process, which again, based off of the question stem, was 23,000 units. That means we started 85,000 units during the month. We had began the month with 14,000 units. That means we have 99,000 units we have to account for during the month of June. So now that we know physically there's 99,000 units to account for, we started with 14,000, we started an additional 85,000. The question is, where did they end up? So we go to our units accounted for section. As we said, 76,000 units were completed and transferred out. We already know the makeup of where they started. And then there's 23,000 units left over at the end of the month. We've accounted for all 99,000. Remember, this entire section of the units information section, these are actual amounts. If you went into the warehouse and you physically counted each of these categories, you would get these numbers. These are not the theoretical that we have down here. But again, with a production cost report, we have to calculate that equivalent units amount. Notice I'm separating them by the type of cost. I'm separating by direct material versus conversion cost because as the question states, all materials are added at the beginning of the process. That means once I start production on a unit, on a product, they are 100% complete with respect to material. There's no more material that's going to be added to it later on in the production process. So I can now say definitively, with respect to all the direct material costs that that unit will incur, it is 100% done. Whereas conversion costs, it's a little different. And that's why you see with beginning work in process was 35% complete, ending work in process was 60% complete with respect to conversion costs. And remember, what are your conversion costs? That's your direct material, or sorry, that's your direct labor, and that's your manufacturing overhead. Under the FIFO method, your equivalent unit schedule is going to look like this. It'll look like this for weighted average as well, but the calculation is going to be a little different. We start with units started and completed. That's an easy one. And why is that easy? Because that is going to be 100% complete for both material and conversion costs. So how many equivalent units do we have with respect to direct materials that were started and completed? We started and completed 62,000 actual units. Those are 100% complete with respect to direct material. That's why the equivalent units amount is also 62,000. For conversion costs, it's also 100% complete because remember, you incurred all the labor, all the overhead because these are fully completed units and they were all started in the same period. So all conversion costs were incurred in the month of June. That's why this amount is also 62,000. These are 100% complete in the month of June with respect to both direct material and conversion costs. So that's why we don't have to do any calculations there. Now we need to add in beginning work in process with respect to material and labor. Equivalent units with beginning work in process with respect to material, it is 0. Now, why is it 0? Well, what is beginning work in process? Beginning work in process is inventory we worked on in the prior period. If these units were started in the prior period, then when was the direct material cost incurred? Was it incurred in the month of June in the current period? No, it was incurred in the prior period. So with respect to the amount of work we did this month, we cannot include the equivalent units with respect to direct material in the June production report because they were incurred in a prior month. Maybe it was May, maybe it was April. I don't know, but I know for a fact it was not incurred in June. So I have no equivalent units measure with respect to beginning work in process for direct material. Now for conversion costs, I am going to incur additional labor and overhead to complete those beginning work in process units. Remember when it said that they were 35% complete with respect to conversion costs. So in other words, 35% of the total labor and overhead had already been incurred. And we said that these 14,000 units were completed and transferred during the month of June. They already had 35% of their conversion costs. That means they needed an additional 65% of conversion costs to complete them. So to get this equivalent units number for beginning work in process, I take that equivalent unit, or sorry, I take the units in beginning work in process, which was 14,000, and I multiply it by 1 minus the rate of conversion cost completion. In this case, it'd be 1 minus 35%. That's how I get the 65% figure here, the 0.65. What that means is I had to add an additional 65% of labor and overhead to those beginning work in process units to finish completion of them. So I did the equivalent of completing from scratch 9,100 units with respect to conversion costs. And the key there, it is 1 minus the completion rate for beginning work in process inventory under FIFO method. The last element I have to calculate is the equivalent units in ending work in process for the month of June. We had 23,000 units actually in ending work in process. Remember, those are all 100% complete as soon as I start production with respect to direct material costs. So the equivalent units amount is going to be 100% for direct materials. That same effort, I could fully complete 23,000 units as far as their direct material costs because they've received all of their direct material costs in the month of June. So its equivalent units measure is 23,000. So for direct materials, its total equivalent units for the month of June is 62,000 plus the 23,000 in ending work in process. For conversion costs are 60% complete in the month of June with respect to conversion costs. So these 23,000 units, each of them are 60% complete. So they've received 60% of the total direct labor and overhead they will incur. From a theoretical standpoint, I could have 23,000 units that are each 60% complete, or I could have fully completed with respect to conversion costs 13,800 units. The 23,000 actual in ending work in process multiplied by the 60% conversion cost completion rate. My equivalent units measure is 13,800. So my total equivalent units with respect to conversion costs, so the amount of work I've done with respect to conversion costs, the amount of costs I've incurred, I could have fully completed 84,900 units with respect to conversion costs. These are the amounts that we will use when they ask us to calculate the the product cost per unit. And since we have different amounts here, you would calculate a direct material cost per unit for the month of June, and then you would calculate a conversion cost per unit for the month of June.